Okay, we are gonna live. So welcome to all, and we are also gonna start. Thank you for being here. This is like the fifth step up of our series of Step Up, Road to COP 2026. Just a few words about the initiative. The Step Ups are this capacity building webinar related to the very hot topic regarding the negotiation and the incoming COP26. Now we are on the fifth step, as I said before, and that is about climate finance. Together with us today, we have Charlene Watson, Kathy Yotong Lee, and Agatha Janalezi. We will go into the roundtable soon, but before going into that, let's a little bit warm up, seeing a video regarding climate finance. So just one moment that I share my screen.
In the distant future, but happening now, and it is already having severe consequences for societies and people's livelihoods. Politicians, scientists, civil society organizations, and advocacy groups, such as the Heinrich Böll Stiftung, as well as communities around the world, are grappling with these impacts and costs. Potential ways towards a sustainable and just future exist, but shifting away from fossil fuels and strengthening the resilience of communities, ecosystems, and economies is expensive. Some, but not enough financing for climate action has been pledged and collected to ensure that funds are available for the necessary changes. But where does the money come from? The money should come from the countries that are responsible for the damage and have the capacity to make it right. This is a matter of justice, climate justice. Industrialized economies such as the United States, England, and Germany have profited from carbon-intensive economic development. But this development path is no longer an option for poor countries that need to skip a few steps and go directly to using clean, renewable energy. Meanwhile, small island nations and heavily indebted poor countries are hit the worst by the impacts of climate change. This is even more unfair considering that their contribution to the problem has been minuscule. In these countries, the worst affected people are the poor and marginalized, women, the disabled, the elderly, and the indigenous peoples. Climate change aggravates existing problems such as inequality, discrimination, and poverty. This is why climate finance should be targeted to help vulnerable population groups. Rich countries owe developing countries a historic climate debt. Based on the key principle of climate justice, that polluters must pay, it is their obligation to help pay for the costs of addressing climate change. So, how much money is needed? Careful estimates say hundreds of billions, if not trillions. And the longer we wait to tackle climate change, the more expensive it gets. In 2009 in Copenhagen, industrialized countries committed to contributing $100 billion annually by 2020 to address the issue. Since then, many climate funds and initiatives have sprung up. But rich countries' contributions have yet to reach their goals. And the long-term future of many climate funds is not secure. While rich countries are supposed to take the lead, most of the money today comes from the private sector, and governments increasingly give loans that need to be paid back. However, loans place a strain on poor recipients, and investors often have priorities that do not align with the needs of communities and countries. This is why public climate finance should be mostly in the form of grants, especially for helping communities adapt to the impacts of climate change. But what's this money for in practice? Climate finance is used to fund projects in mitigation or adaptation, and more in cross-cutting activities that combine both. Funding for adaptation builds hurricane shelters or seawalls. It restores mangrove forests or wetlands, helps manage water systems to deal with severe droughts or floods, and provides farmers with better seeds and forecasts to improve their yield despite unpredictable weather. When done well, these projects allow communities to bear the worst effects of climate change and adjust their livelihoods to an uncertain future. Mitigation projects reduce greenhouse gas emissions by shifting energy production towards sustainable sources. Examples of this include funding for clean transport in cities, generating renewable energy from wind and solar power, or planting trees in deforested areas. These projects can address energy poverty in rural areas by distributing renewable energy to people who have never had electricity. They provide clean cooking solutions to the 2.7 billion people worldwide still using traditional biomass fuels like wood or dung. And they also provide entrepreneurs with the cheap loans needed to buy energy-efficient equipment. However, not all mitigation projects are good projects. Large hydroelectric dams can displace people and destroy their livelihoods, while growing food crops for biofuel can increase food insecurity. Misguided climate mitigation can easily make things worse. The most successful projects put people first and give communities and marginalized groups a strong voice in designing and selecting them. With so little money available for climate projects, only the ones that do no harm to people or the environment, and the ones that benefit human rights and gender equality, should be funded. But there is so much more to understanding climate finance. Check out our following videos on the gender dimensions of climate finance and on the Green Climate Fund, one of the largest public global climate funds.
Okay, we have seen this brief video to warm up, and there was a YouTube video that we try to use to introduce the topic. But before running into that through the roundtable, I will give briefly the floor to Agatha Giannalesi, that is the focal point of the Yanko Working Group on Finance. So Agatha, if you want to spend a few words also on the activity on the Working Group on Finance of Yango.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you, Domenico, for the invitation in participating in this webinar. It is actually the first webinar we are participating in as a Yango Climate Finance and Carbon Market Working Group. So it's a great pleasure to be here tonight with you. So as mentioned, we are a Yango working group. So we are part of the official youth delegation to the UNFCCC. And we have been reactivated a few months ago. So we are not an expert group, but more our main goal is to build the capacity of the working group members and of younger members in general, and of any young person interested on this topic of climate finance and carbon markets, so as to ensure that the youth can participate and be heard on these topics within and beyond the UNFCCC. So in terms of activity, well, we sometimes provide inputs on concept note. We have already submitted a few input requested by the COP26 unit on finance, on facilitating access to climate finance, for example. We also intend to participate in events and webinars like this one, and basically to support initiatives that are related to improving access to climate finance for youth-led or youth-focused projects in particular. And in terms of topics, well, we intend to cover, of course, the items that are related to climate finance and carbon market under the Paris Agreement. But we are happy to explore basically all innovative schemes to provide financing for climate adaptation and mitigation projects, and especially where most needed, so in developing country and for young people.
Thank you very much, Agatha. Now let's turn into the discussion and to the roundtable. And I'll give the floor to the moderator, Kervel Baird and Priti. Just before the roundtable, I will explain how we wanted to create this session. We collected the question directly from the Yango member through a survey, and from that we gathered properly a list of questions for the speaker. So I'll give the floor to the moderator to introduce themselves and also introduce the speakers and go on. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Domenico. Thanks for joining us, everyone. I'm Cavell from Trinidad and Tobago, and I'll be co-moderating this session with Priti. Priti, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello everyone, I am Preeti Saka and I'll be co-moderating with Carvel in the section. Thank you.
And today joining Agath, we have Kathy, who is a global coordination team member at YONGO, the official constituency of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and also a fundraising officer at the UN Climate Change Conference of Youth. And Charlene Watson, a research associate in climate and sustainability at the Overseas Development Institutes. So to begin our roundtable, Chrissy, would you like to ask the first question to Aga?
Yeah, sure. So begin with the first question is for Agat. The question is like, for the sake of our audience, can you please tell us more about climate adaptation, climate mitigation, and sustainable investment?
Yeah, sure. Well, so thank you for the question. So, well, there's two ways not to tackle climate change or to approach climate change. One is climate adaptation and one is climate mitigation. So climate adaptation deals with the anticipation of adverse effects of climate change and how can we take appropriate action now to prevent or minimize the damage that climate change may cause. While mitigation is about trying to lessen the impact of climate change by reducing, while attacking one of the main causes of climate change, meaning reducing emission of greenhouse gas. And so, well, example of mitigation projects are projects that are related to reducing the sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So for example, shifting to renewable energy or establishing cleaner mobility system, while adaptation would be, okay, how can we build infrastructure that will protect population against adverse effects that we cannot prevent anymore? So building defense against sea level rise, and things like that. And if any of my co-speakers or fellow speakers tonight would like to add anything, or if there's anything missing, please go ahead. And sustainable investment, well, it's basically channeling, like ensuring that we can channel finance for sustainable projects, and climate finance is a step further, like projects that that tackle climate mitigation or climate adaptation. And so there's different way to steer financial flow towards more sustainable activities. Some of them are, for example, taxonomies, and there's different vehicles as well to steer financial flow. So you have funds that exist under the UNFCCC, but also outside. And yeah, it's quite a wide sector nowadays, I would say.
Thanks, Agath. Next to Charlene, warm welcome to you again. Thanks for joining us. Would you be able to tell us more about ODI and what you do there?
Thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me this evening. It's a pleasure to speak to you all and hear everybody who's very enthusiastic and very keen on this. I'm really happy to see that. ODI is a think tank based in London, and overall it works towards a sustainable and peaceful world. So the idea behind ODI being a think tank is that we harness evidence and ideas through research and through partnership. And through that way, then we confront challenges, develop solutions, and ideally create change. What's really interesting about ODI is that we're less on the advocacy side and more in providing the evidence-based. And that applies to my work as well. So I work a lot in climate finance. So I'm part of the climate and sustainability team. I work predominantly on climate finance. So I've been working on climate finance for about 10 years now. At the beginning, much more around public climate finance, the multilateral climate change funds. That then broadens out to multilateral development banks, bilateral public climate finance, and then more recently into NDC financing and making all finance flows consistent with the Paris Agreement. In addition to myself, we have many others on the team, and they also do a lot of work around fossil fuel subsidies and their phase out, finance for land use, for example. So the idea is really just to become expert advisors, as I said, using that real evidence base for new ideas, new solutions. Thank you.
Okay, now the first question for Kathy is like, as you have been working very closely to COE, so what is the update to COE 16th right now? Can you give some updates on that?
Yep. First, thanks so much for inviting me. And yes, so I basically, I think, so our Zoom audience are probably mostly, if not all, younger members, but I think some audience joining from Facebook might not be familiar with COE. So I think maybe I can start with like a brief introduction of COE. So COE stands for the 16th UN Climate Change Conference of Youth, which will be held in Glasgow and just a few days before the COP26. And Yango, and we're the youth constituency of UNFCCC. We're a main organizer for it. And I personally sit in the finance unit and global affairs unit. So I finance unit, I'm a fundraising officer, focusing on corporate partnership. And at global affairs, I'm a country coordinator. And actually, I think Agathe here is also in the global affairs unit. I think she's a regional coordinator of Northern Europe, if my memory is correct. And so I think to give a brief overview of the whole conference. So basically we were to form a position paper made by youth around the world, and because because we're the official constituency of UNFCCC, we're able to participate in the multilateral negotiation process, and because COE is officially endorsed by UN, UNFCCC, UNOSCI, etc. So we're able to submit our position paper, which will be actually included in the negotiation of COP26. So that's a very brief overview of COE. And if any of the audience are interested in, for example, what we do at finance unit or what we do at global affairs unit, basically, as it says, the finance, we raise the money, and hopefully we can cover all the fees for all delegates. And at global affairs, we communicate with universities, organizations, and for each of the organization or university to form their own position paper, and to summarize that one, we will summarize that to a general position paper to be included in the negotiation process of COP26. So yeah, that's a very brief introduction. And yeah, if anyone have any questions about it, feel free to ask in the Q&A section at the end. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Kathy. So going back to Agathe, could you explain to us the current structure of the funds provided by the Paris agreements? Your mic is unmuted.
Sorry, thanks, Carol, for that next question. I will try my best. It's quite a complex landscape. So basically, under the UNFCCC, developed countries have committed to support developing countries in tackling climate change. And for that, under the UNFCCC, they set up what is called the financial mechanism provided for by Article 11 of the Convention. So under that Article 11, and this financial mechanism, they have set up different funds to mobilize capital and fund mitigation and adaptation action in developing countries. The operation of this financial mechanism has been entrusted to two international entities, the Global Environment Facility and the Green Climate Funds. This financial mechanism is accountable to the Conference of the Parties, which decides which policy or program priority or eligibility criteria will will exist for funding, for disbursing the capital. And furthermore, well, the parties to the convention, so to the UNFCCC, they have established 4 special funds. One is the Special Climate Change Fund, another one is the Least Developed Country Fund, another one is the Green Climate Fund that I already mentioned, and the 4th one is the Adaptation Fund. So they have a different mandate, if I can say, or different focus area or beneficiary focus. And I think that, well, that's basically the foundation for climate finance and the UNFCCC and the funds structure so far. But I'm sure that Charlene maybe can jump in for this question. I don't know, I'm not sure that is absolutely complete. So if you want to add a few words, Charlene, that would be great.
Thanks a lot, Agatha. And I think it's a very useful introduction. I think there's a difference between climate finance with small c and small f and climate finance with a big C and a big F. And what you've explained very well is the climate finance with the big C and the big F that talks about the flows from developed to developing countries. So we have this very useful financial mechanism under which there are 5 multilateral climate change funds. There are also multilateral climate change funds that sit outside of the UNFCCC process. They include, for example, the World Bank's climate investment funds, but there are others. In addition to which we get developed to developing country transfers through bilateral aid agencies. So for example, the FCDO or BEIS in the UK or BMU and BMZ in Germany. And then the third layer of the international public climate finance flows with the capital C, capital F would be the multilateral development banks, I would say. So World Bank, Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, for example. But yeah, that was a good, it's very difficult to get a definition. There's no global definition. So I think, Agatha, you did a very good job. Thank you.
Yeah, over to you, Charlene, again. The next question to you is, why is climate finance so critically in realizing Paris Agreement, most especially as we are recovering from the pandemic? Like since we have been recovering from the pandemic, what has been the impact over the climate finance regarding the Paris Agreement here? Like, has there been any impacts or changes yet?
Thanks very much. So the question has kind of a lot of pieces to it. So why is climate finance critically important in realizing the Paris Agreement? I think that's worth dwelling on as well. As it said in the video, there's a historical responsibility for developed countries that have emitted in the past to support developing countries. I think in addition to that, we should realize that climate finance, in particular, the 100 billion commitment for climate finance, is not based on developing countries' needs. Again, as said in the video, it goes into the hundreds of billions. So the fact that there is climate finance in the agreement and on the table is a show of trust and faith and confidence. So we have to meet these targets because otherwise people won't even bother to come to the table and make their own commitments. So why do we need climate finance? Is because developing countries did not cause the problem and they're suffering the impacts. It's because we need to make sure that people stay at the table and we have trust and faith in the UNFCCC process. And then the last part of the question was, why is it so important now that we're in the pandemic? So I think, there's no denying that 2020 and 2021 has been a tough year for everybody, developed and developing countries alike. And I think that means there's extra pressure on public resources. So from a developed country perspective, there's been cuts in aid, for example, the UK. And it's cut its target for aid spending from 0.7% of gross national income to 0.5%, and that then undermines its climate support in some of the most vulnerable countries, which is not great. We can't have these countries that cause the problem cutting their aid programs and making the most vulnerable more vulnerable. In addition to which, a lot of developing country governments are not having the kind of revenues that they used to have from trade, from taxes, so on and so forth. They're struggling with debt repayments. And so now they have this twofold challenge. They need to find climate finance to continue on with adaptation and mitigation efforts, but they also have huge other immediate priorities around health, education, social welfare, jobs, and so on and so forth. So there have been some real efforts to try and join these two things. So we need to stimulate economies. We need to get people back on track. We need to get health systems working and functioning and, you know, basically prevented from collapse. How do we do that in a way that prioritizes mitigation and adaptation actions? So, for example, we could help create jobs in the land use sector that maybe plant trees, or, you know, promote sustainable agriculture. If we're going to bail out the airlines or, you know, promote rail travel, maybe we can do that with conditionalities, whether it's reducing emissions or increasing energy efficiency. So there's been this big drive towards a green recovery, but I think the baseline is developing countries have even higher debt burdens now. They have even less public finance to undertake adaptation and mitigation actions. So more than ever, they need the support of developed countries in order that they can continue to seek to meet their Paris Agreement commitments. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlene. And over to Kathy. Could you give us your idea of how sustainable finance positively impacts youth and our future?
Yep. Thanks for the question. So, so basically, because sustainable finance is to consider ESG, the ESG elements when making investment decisions in the financial sector, in very short. So basically to increase the long-term investments into like sustainable economic activities or projects. So because it plays a very important part in the sustainable development as a whole. So because we as youth are very important stakeholders of the whole sustainable development. So for example, including climate change, and so the transitioning towards sustainable finance is really important for all of us because of it. You know, especially youth among everyone, because we're a very important stakeholder of it, and also that we're the ones who will take the consequences in the future. So it makes it extremely important for us. And yeah, that's a very brief answer for that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Kathy. Now the next question is for Agad. Like, has climate finance really influenced the NDCs so as to build the roadmap to reality?
Sorry, I keep starting while still being mute. Thank you for the question, Pretty. I'm not sure I'm so familiar with that expression of road to reality. And I think the question is actually can be asked the other way around. No, it's like how climate finance can influence NDC, because this is a major challenge for developing country again. No, that they need help, they need financial support to achieve their NDC. And at the precise moment that we're talking, we know that the needs of this developing country to meet their NDC is 40 times higher than the commitment of donor countries. So you can see here, well, there's a real significant gap, while there's a conditionality for developing country to achieve their NDC on access to climate finance. So how can we build on that? I think, as Charlene mentioned, well, most, I don't know if that's completely correct, but like a significant part of finance that have been directed at supporting developing country in climate adaptation and mitigation is public finance. And what we need now, and I think what we stand for as well as a Yongo working group on finance and market is like, how can we mobilize the private sector in investing in this mitigation and adaptation action in developing countries, because public finance is not sufficient and is not sufficient for these countries to meet their NDC at the moment. And that raises another question, which is the one of like, how can we, well, to allocate the right amount of capital, you also need to have the right estimates in terms of needs. And there as well, there are some shortages at the moment. And in the NDC themselves that are submitted, some mention clearly and strongly, with clear evidence of what is the finance needed to meet their NDC and their ambition and their program development in terms of fighting and adapting to climate change. But many others NDC doesn't provide any kind of estimate on what is needed to achieve their NDC. So that is another things to move forward. And in the relationship between climate finance and NDC. And then the other one is, of course, that it's a broader one, but if funding is allocated to support the achievement of NDC, it is really important to track and to monitor if this funding is actually effective in supporting this country to meet their NDCs. So I hope that answered the question, and I would just like to thank also all the member of the working group who helped in preparing this webinar, because of course I'm talking here on behalf of the whole working groups. Thanks.
Kathy or Charlene, would you like to give your thoughts on the relationship between climate finance and the NDCs?
So I think Charlene will probably be a better person to answer that, because fun fact, I actually study finance. So my part is more like corporate finance than climate finance in general. So I think this would probably be a better question for Charlene. Thanks.
So climate finance with the capital C, capital F, I think it's very important for NDCs and NDC ambition. A number of countries, as has already been mentioned, have differentiated targets. So one target is their climate change ambition, predominantly with respect to mitigation, that says, we can achieve this many emission reductions. However, our conditionality, if you give us international public climate finance, we can achieve a higher level of emissions reductions. So I think that's the conditionality, saying, if we continue to raise climate finance and program climate finance from developed to developing countries, we can stimulate higher ambition for NDCs. I think also it's worth, it's been alluded to a number of times. We're mostly talking about the public climate finance flows, but you can have private finance going to support climate change. And I think we know that the discussion is a little bit incomplete if we don't go all the way and think about, what is the role of NDCs and what is the role of the international negotiations, so on and so forth, in stimulating private sector investment. And so there's just two things I'd like to mention. The first is that public finance is incredibly important in leveraging and raising private finance, so reducing different risks and barriers to private investment in climate change. And the second is that when a country has an NDC and starts kind of taking steps to implement it and identifying different pathways in different sectors, maybe in infrastructure or in energy or in agriculture, for example, then private sector has a signal from government of future direction. And then they themselves can start aligning behind plans such as NDCs. So it's all a very related system. And I think it's important to be aware of the different aspects. Of course, we can't all be experts in everything. But yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlene. And staying with you, could you explain to us how the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund work, and why is it difficult for youth initiatives to access the Green Climate Fund?
Okay, how do these funds work? So the multilateral climate change funds, they're multilateral in nature, which means that they pool contributor resources. And then these contributor resources are governed, in these cases, by a board that is both developed and developing country, civil society and private sector. And then they make decisions about what the fund is going to use that money for, priorities, work programs, the different range of financial instruments that can be used. So the adaptation fund is also linked to the clean development mechanism and carbon markets. And it has a proportion of credits that come from there. It's a relatively small proportion. And by and large, the fund has been propped up by contributions from developed countries. The adaptation fund is focused on adaptation only and is much smaller than the Green Climate Fund. So the Green Climate Fund was kind of said to be the fund of funds. It became operational in 2015, and sure enough, it is the fund with the highest number of pledges from developed countries, and it now also has the highest number of approvals for projects in developing countries. The Green Climate Fund funds adaptation, mitigation, and cross-cutting projects. It uses grants, concessional loans, equity, and guarantees. So it uses the range of financial instruments that we see across the climate funds. And it also has a private sector facility in a sense that it tries to encourage private sector engagement in climate action. So, of course, they only work if developed countries contribute, although it is worth noting that developing countries contribute to these funds on a voluntary basis. And they only work if the board functions and the organizations themselves function. So the Green Climate Fund actually has a number of policies and processes that it's still yet to agree on and put in place. And the politics within that are moving very, very slowly. It still remains, however, a very useful multilateral climate change fund. And I would not advocate for taking money out of it or not funding it. I think it's incredibly important for trust and faith. And we do have to recognize how big it is, how fast it has moved money, and how much faster than other funds it has gone. So that's kind of how they work. There's a lot of challenges with multilateral climate change funds, and these are not necessarily unique to the Green Climate Funds and the Adaptation Funds. And a lot of that is around dispersals and making sure we're getting money to the most vulnerable countries, partly because the definition of what is a vulnerable country is challenging and one that's a little bit elusive. And also just because it's hard to show impact. So should you be funding the most transformational mitigation impact? So for example, shifting the energy sector, or should you be looking for the cheapest emissions reduction per ton? So there's a few challenges in making sure you have effective climate finance. Why is it difficult to get access? So there's obviously a lot of competition for these resources, and there's a lot of different competing priorities. But the Green Climate Funds and all funds, it's very difficult to get access to what is actually quite a small pot of money. But this money is an importantly small pot of money because it should be able to take the most risk. So, you know, give the most grant finance and take the most risk. Now, the access procedures have been difficult, mostly because I'm not sure about Youth Initiative in particular, but other institutions have found it difficult because you have to have very, very high fiduciary capacities. It's really like opening a very, very, it's a very invasive procedure where people look through how the organization is managed, what's your size, how well you are, what's your due diligence, so on and so forth. So the costs are quite high. The process is very invasive, and it's taking a lot of institutions a very long time to even get access to it, because to have a project approved, you need to be kind of accredited or be working with an entity that has been accredited. So there have been efforts. The Adaptation Fund in particular has kind of pioneered this issue of direct access. There's also simplified approval procedures under the Green Climate Funds, and all of this is, you know, and other methods have all been put in place to try and improve access. So access is one of a running theme over the last decade about how do we make access to climate finance easier, faster, better, more efficient. I think, again, it's been something that's just gone very slow. Like, this is public finance. It should be taking more risks. But at the same time, a lot of the taxpayers, and I'm sure, you know, many of you on this have paid tax, you know, we also want our money to go to the right places. And so you have this tension between public taxpayers and public finance, which should be able to take risks. So if it fails, we should accept that some climate finance may fail. But at the same time, there's a lot of accountability that is wanted back at home on these finance. So there's many issues. I don't think nobody is to blame. It's a very complicated system. But I do think we need to very much improve access to climate finance. And I think we need a bit more coordinated learning on that. And there's a key role for civil society in this, like youth, to continue to push on that door to make sure it doesn't become a forgotten issue. But thanks. I'm not sure if it answered your question exactly, but I hope it was useful.
Yeah, thank you, Shirley. Now up to Kathy again. There's this general saying that without private finance, $100 billion can't be achieved. So how true is that? And can you tell us more about available private finance innovations that are open for youth?
Yeah, first, thanks for the question. And I would say it is true because according to my memory, in the original report, it said that the $100 billion is supposed to come from both public and private sector. So both public finance and private finance. So of course, I think that it is important for private finance to take their part. And just a very brief introduction. So the $100 billion goal is a quite important pillar of the Paris Agreement, and also as mentioned in the video at the beginning of this webinar, so the $100 billion per year is supposed to be from developed countries, parties to mobilize this amount of money per year by 2020 in order to tackle like the needs of developing countries. Especially that it's really important for them to grow their economy at the same time while trying to become more sustainable. And it has been hard because of the pandemic. And I remember, I think that because of the impact of the pandemic is one of the reasons. So the amount of $100 billion has not yet been fully realized. I think according to my memory, OECD had a report that I think they only reached about $79 billion in 2018. And like the years before 2018 were even lower. And it's actually growing, but not yet reached the $100 billion yet. So although we've seen this growth in this amount, but they have not yet reached $100 million, which means and also especially that this growth, most of it came from actually loans. So which means that they actually increased the risk of further indebting developing countries, especially with the impact of the pandemic. So it caused more uncertainty and it brings more risks. And I think I read a report from UN last year that they already mentioned back then it's pretty unlikely for them to actually reach the goal by 2020. But they've actually brought up this new strategy to suggest that to use this pandemic to shift all of the investments and financing and for both the public finance and then private finance in the next few years. So their plan is to surpass that $100 billion goal in this year, 2021, through like increasing international public finance mostly. And also by 2025, they plan to, for developed countries to double or even triple it if they can to the current about $12 billion grants for climate action. And for private finance innovation for youth, I think personally I'm not aware of many like innovations. I think there are only a few from international organizations or foundations. I think one example is probably like CIFF's Youth Climate Leadership grants, but I personally don't think there are many. But if Agathe or Charlene knows, feel free to add it. Thanks.
Kathy, so over to Agathe. So we've been talking about the public and private funds. Could you explain to us some more about the role of these funds in building resilience and what gaps you think need to address, whether it's transparency or consistency, just as Charlene would have highlighted some challenges?
Yeah, thanks, Carol, for the question. I think that was a really interesting previous answer from both Charlene and Kathy in underlining some challenges. So the role of funds, I think it has been covered already by Kerry and Charlene. Well, a fund is basically an instrument or a vehicle to collect, to mobilize some funding, some finance, some capital, some money, in other words, that you will then disburse or allocate to different projects or programs according to policy and guidelines of each particular fund. So you have funds that are focused on the least developed country, you have funds that are focused on adaptation, you have funds that are focused on a particular sector like agriculture. And the idea is just like to, in a very simple terms, to gather, to mobilize some capital, and then to disperse it according to certain policies. In terms of challenges, so I wouldn't say, I wouldn't advance on any challenges related to transparency and consistency. Transparency, I know that there are some challenges there, and maybe Charlene can say a word on that afterwards, because I am not familiar with these issues. I think most of the issue that I see and that we see so far as a working group had been covered already, and it's again like, yeah, okay, how can we mobilize more private investment? Another issue is also like, how can we, again, in the same vein of improving access to finance, how can we improve access to finance for small projects? Because there's of course like the challenge of mobilizing capital on one side, but then there's a problem of accessing capital, and especially for small projects and especially for youth. That means that, for example, if you go to a fund, I'm taking like one randomly, the Global Environmental Facility, that might be not a good example because one of them have a small grant program, but let's say it's not the one that I'm picking right now. They will provide some grants for projects that are worth, let's say, $1 million minimum. So you can apply for like, okay, if your project, you don't need $1 million, but you cannot apply for funding through this institution if you have like a small scale project, basically. And I think there are a lot of initiatives on the ground in developing countries and that are led by youth that would require some funding, but not $1 million or $2 million funding, just maybe 100,000 would be a significant funding for such projects, and project that would have like a pretty significant impact within this community, in this geography, in bringing like social and environmental benefits. And these projects, they are out of the grid in terms of accessing climate finance. So two things here is like, okay, how can we, or on the side of the funds, well, they accept to give funding for smaller projects, or we can find a mechanism, a way to maybe bundle a small project together so that they reach like the ticket size of $1 million or more, and then get this funding and share the capital among this project. So this I see as a big challenge in the coming year for allocation of funds capital. And especially for youth, and we will not keep to, we will keep underlying that, is that youth is also out of the grid in terms of funding from multilateral funds. It is extremely difficult for already super well organized institution to access finance from multilateral funds, bilateral funds. But imagine for youth organizations, that's like mission impossible mission. So so this is like that's a real challenge, and I think there's a lot to do for that, for improving access to capital for use. Thank you.
Thank you, Agar. Now to Charlene again. The question to you is like, exploring loss and damage finance and its place on the global stockage was in articles of yours. Can you please say a few words about loss and damage finance?
In the environment where you need the lights, constant internet. Like I should even need to moderate part of this session before, like section 1 to 4, part of the moderator.
Sure, I can speak to loss and damage, no problem. Yeah, so loss and damage is a very old concept. I think it has appeared as early as 1991 as a submission from the Alliance of Small Island States. And the idea is that climate change mitigation, so removing or reducing emissions, and adaptation, so adjusting to and minimizing the harm of climate change, will be insufficient to tackle all climate impacts. So there will be climate impacts that we will not be able to mitigate enough to avoid, and we will not be able to adapt enough to avoid. These might include sea level rise, for example, for some small islands that are very low lying. It might mean that there's some migration. It might mean some agricultural areas will just not be arable anymore. So this is the concept of loss and damage, and it creates both economic losses as well as non-economic losses. So cultural damage, social issues, so on and so forth. So that's the idea of what is loss and damage, and it's now been recognized by the IPCC in their recent report. So it's been giving a scientific base as well as it having a base in climate justice. It, however, took more than 2 decades in negotiations before the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage was established in 2013. And then the Paris Agreement in 2015 actually gave loss and damage its own article. So it being its own self-standing article gave loss and damage kind of a bit more standing under the UNFCCC. However, it says that there will be support for loss and damage. And this was not directly interpreted as finance, but support for countries, for developing countries in particular. However, there is no question that we will need finance if we want to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. But the topic has been incredibly politically charged because there is this element of possible liability. So if you raise the issue of liability or compensation, obviously that could go into absolutely huge numbers, and developed countries are wary of that and what that bill would look like. So there is a separate article that tries to reduce liability. So it takes off the table liability, but in that it should mean that developed countries then support developing countries to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. But as I said, the topic has been incredibly politically charged, and loss and damage historically has been separated, and intentionally has been separated from finance discussions and climate finance discussions. So it sits outside of the commitments for developed countries to collectively mobilize the 100 billion a year by 2020. So in terms of kind of what happens next, we are gathering momentum. And the kind of the scientific base, the moral obligation is there to support, and we're seeing losses and damages with all the hurricanes that we've been seeing recently. It's real, it's there, and developing countries need support. So at COP25 in Madrid, a year and a half ago now, loss and damage was anchored. The finance was anchored loss and damage was anchored in the financial architecture, by assuming that the Green Climate Fund could continue to provide financial resources for averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. And I think the recent paper we've written thinks through some of the practical challenges of loss and damage finance, including, for example, for the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, to continue funding loss and damage, it would need to have the right accredited entities, the right expertise in order to assess loss and damage and implement loss and damage projects. And it's not what it was designed for. So how well are these entities in doing that? It's not clear yet. So I think many developing countries are moving forward with articulating loss and damage and the loss and damage finance they might need. I think we need to push from multiple angles on this. there is no space, there is no support for countries to articulate these. So for example, we have NDCs, we have national adaptation plans, we have nationally appropriate mitigation actions, we have national adaptation plans of action, we have so many planning processes, but these to date have not included loss and damage. So we need to kind of ramp up the support for this kind of reporting and articulating of your needs and the losses and damages that might be incurred. And we also need to think through, what does a good financing mechanism for loss and damage look like? At the moment, it's incredibly political. So to push for something under the financial mechanism, I personally would argue that it's too soon. But I do not think that can be used as an excuse to do nothing about funding and financing loss and damage. What we should do is we should work through bilateral mechanisms, through multilateral climate change funds outside of the UNFCCC architecture, through regional bodies, through national bodies, in order to start funding it, start understanding what is it that needs to be funded, what are the right financial mechanisms that can do this, or financial instruments that can do this appropriately. For example, is it insurance, or are there others? And then we can kind of have this process of learning whereby we can really understand what is the most effective and efficient way to address, to minimize and avert loss and damage. And the paper just emphasizes that because the Paris Agreement talks about support for loss and damage and doesn't specifically say finance, the global stocktake, which will start in 2022 and be, at the moment, will start in 2022 and be completed by 2023, has loss and damage as a cross-cutting theme, or at least it will be included in the technical dialogues. And therefore, we are provided with an opportunity to talk about loss and damage finance in the global stocktake. And we should grasp that opportunity until another opportunity comes up under the UNFCCC. But I urge you to read the paper. We tried to make it a bit of a primer on loss and damage finance as well, for those that haven't necessarily engaged with the topic before. Thank you.
Charlene. So Kathy, over to you. After Charlene explained all the difficulties that arise in the negotiations in COP, could you update us on what we can expect on negotiations for this coming COP26 and COP16?
Yeah, thanks. So first, my wish for COP is to happen successfully, and there are rumors that it will be hybrid format, or that it might be delayed. All I hope is that it will happen successfully, and I hope that it will provide the space for all the delegations to work collectively, and also to also bring youth to the table, given that there might be some difficulties due to the pandemic or others. So yeah, that's like the first wish. And also I think, in terms of like the negotiation room, I hope that that they will continue to engage youth at the table, and I'm really looking forward for all of us to have like the best COI ever, and then also to form an amazing position paper that will be taken into account in the COP26 negotiations, and so our role at in the finance unit and global affairs unit is to support and to make COI happen, and also to let youth delegates to share their opinions. And as for specific like topics I personally look forward to, I guess like NDC is and it will continue to play a really, really important part, and also carbon cutting by 2030 as well. But I will not go into details because I'm not an expert at that. But if anyone want to jump in, or any other topics that any of you think that will be important for COP26 and also negotiation room, then yeah, feel free to jump in. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. Now the next question is to Agat. Since we have been hearing that a lot more on green bonds, what do you think, like what exactly are green bonds?
Thanks, Pretty, for the question. So I will try to keep it simple. So green bonds is a financial instrument to raise capital on capital market, actually. So there is a different way that you can get capital, so money, in other words. You can go to a bank and ask for a loan, for example. But another way is to borrow money on capital markets. So in other terms, you will issue some debt on capital financial markets, and investors will buy share of this debt, and that will count as some investment for the amount that you want to borrow on capital markets. So green bonds is a bit of a different type of bond, in a way that the money that you borrow on the market should be guaranteed to be spent for projects that have demonstrated environmental benefits. And there's like, well, there's clear guidelines for that. One of them is like the green bonds principle that like explain like, okay, what kind of project or program would be eligible for funding under a green bonds. The other particularity of this instrument is that, well, it is available for both private and public parties. So that means that states, cities, region, but as well companies can issue a bond. And of course, well, the whole process is quite complex one, but I think that's the essential. Thanks for the question. I hope that was insightful.
Thanks, Agath. So as we come to an end, we discussed the $100 billion goal for 2025. So my question to Charlene is, how close are we?
Thanks a lot. It depends who you are and what you count. So, you know, I've said already about the importance of the target and what it represents. And I think it's very important to think about what you're trying to do with the story and the narrative you build about the 100 billion. We need more climate finance, and we need more climate finance as quick as possible. I also think that we could spend a lot of time debating on exactly how much money it is down to the dollar, or we could focus more time on shifting away from the things that are clearly climate incompatible, or potentially we can do both because we have a growing community. But that's just my plea to make sure that the narrative that you kind of decide to promote and use in advocacy and talk about is the right one, because really it depends on who you are and what you count. So the goal itself of the 100 billion, if you actually look back at the Copenhagen Accords, the goal is purposefully worded so that countries could reach political agreement, and it would allow the heads of states flexibility in its interpretation and application. It doesn't help at all for any kind of tracking or accountability towards the goal. Paul Bodnar, who was ex-State Department, wrote a very good paper with ODI and WRI colleagues that talks about what counts. So it includes, we've talked about financial instruments, for example. Do you only count the grant element, the bit that you don't have to pay back? Or how do you count a concessional loan or a guarantee, for example, or equity? How do you count that? What about if a youth organization in the UK received the money from the UK to help developing countries? If the money stayed in the UK, does that count as climate finance? So there are many different issues. And the problem is that parties to the convention, or countries, or people in general, most of them assign some weight to all of the different factors and all of the different ways, but it's just not the same between every single person. And this has led to huge discrepancy in what counts. So the OECD, has already been mentioned, they came out with a report at the end of 2020 that if we just talk about the public finance component, and the reason I talk about that is because that is the most transparent, we have about 62 billion from public sources. And the other reason that I talk about that is because Oxfam took that same data and said, well, actually, let's not talk about putting solar panels on a hospital. Let's talk about only where the primary investment was for climate change purposes. And let's only talk about the grant element. They came up with between 19 and 23 billion in public climate finance. And you can understand how huge that difference is, depending on what you count, even when we're talking about international concessional public finance flows. And then, of course, the problem with the private has been mentioned already. We need absolutely more private finance. As Kathy's already mentioned, private finance was squarely in the 100 billion goal. The problem with private finance is that there's no agreed formula to work out how much was mobilized. So the OECD might take a different approach to the MDBs, which take a different approach to each of the bilateral donors. So how much private finance has been mobilized, there's no consistent formula. So maybe it's 7 billion, maybe it's 14 billion. But the bigger problem is probably we don't have good ways of tracking private finance. We don't actually know. So, you know, we don't know how much private finance is going towards adaptation and mitigation. And many private actors may just be doing it as part of business planning, contingency planning. If you're a smallholder farmer in Ethiopia, you are a private actor, and maybe you are changing your seed type and you're changing your soil practices. And that is costing you money to change seed types to have a more drought resistant crop. But we don't know how much money that private actor is paying. So there's a huge question mark over how much private finance there is. Anyway, back to the 100 billion. The 100 billion, you know, there's a time lag in reporting to the UNFCCC. So we will not know until 2022, based on self-reporting, how much developed countries have provided in 2020. So if you believe the OECD, we're getting closer. If you believe Oxfam, we're much further away. But I think you should really probably take a think of for yourself what you count, what you think should count, and then think about, okay, look, we need to meet this 100 billion because we need to have this, people stay at the table. Maybe now let's start thinking about the new goal. So in this COP, we will start talking about the processes through which to agree a new and bigger climate finance goal that will come into effect in 2025. So between 2020 and 2025, we'll have the 100 billion baseline. But this COP will start talking about the processes, maybe the milestones, and what we expect that new goal to look like. And for me personally, my attention is switching to, okay, we know the failures of our old goal. And one of those failures was not, you know, really articulating what we meant. How can we change that this time? Within the political sphere, what can we do differently? Do we need to have a sub-target for adaptation? Do we need to have a sub-target for private finance? Do we need to have a way marker? Is it just like the Fast Start finance period where we said 30 billion? Should we say instead it should be, you know, 1% of GDP? Are there different ways to do this goal better? And I think we should all put our heads together and think about how can we make this better and politically acceptable, as well as keeping an eye on the 100 billion. But I think it's a little bit of both. But I hope that's a helpful answer.
Yeah, surely it is. So thank you, Charlie. Now we're up to the last questions of the roundtable session. It's for all our speakers. Like, do you have, as Gravel asked Kathy previously, do you have any of your words on your expectations from the negotiation room this coming COI and COP? So you can take turns to put forward your words. Starting with Agathe, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, Caravel. Well, I think it's fair to say, as Katie mentioned, that the first hope would be that COP26 is actually happening this year, because we cannot wait one more year, first of all. Second of all, well, I think as a contact point for the Finance and Market Working Group, well, of course, putting the youth up front and improving their chances to get fundings. So we have this ongoing project with the Finance and Market Working Group where we would like to map on one side what is the available funding for that is specifically targeted at youth-led or youth-focused projects. And so far, well, we didn't find a lot of that. And on the other side, to look among younger members in existing initiatives that are seeking for fundings, so that we can move more to practice. No, I think that is also what I hope is that we move to practical action, to implementation of commitments. And I think Yongo is doing a really good work in that sense, in pushing forward and highlighting concrete initiatives that are led by youth. So very proud to be part of this movement, and I will support Yongo's initiative in the lead up to COP26 and at COP26. Thank you.
Now, Charlene, how about your words on that?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? Did you on COP?
Yeah, your expectation from the negotiation room this coming COI and COP.
Thank you very much for repeating the question. I think my expectations, I mean, I talked to them a little bit. I'm very interested in how we think about this process for agreeing the new climate finance goal. I think it's really important that we have equity in process so that all stakeholders are sitting at the table, and that involves all parties, developed or developing, as well as youth, other civil society actors, private sector. I think we really need to sit down and think about what is an effective process going to look like. Where should we have sub-targets? What is actually feasible? What are the way markers? Where would we like to be in 2 years' time? If we have 4 years to negotiate this, where should we be in 2 years' time? And what are the different kind of information inputs that we need to see? And then therefore, organizations like ODI, Yungo, others, we can actually make information input submissions in order that we can try and shape that goal. So I think that's definitely one to look out for me. The other thing for me is the global stock take. So it's very difficult to look from one COP to the next because it's a very short period of time. The global stock take is a 5-year cycle where we take stock of collective progress towards the Paris Agreement. Now, while that process should start in 2022, the Katowice decisions left a lot open in terms of what that's going to look like. I think we shouldn't kind of put it to one side and then all of a sudden realize the global stock take is upon us. And, you know, I've been working with the Independent Global Stock Take, which is a Climate Works funded initiative to think through what would we like the finance themes of the global stock take to address and what would success look like. And if we do that now, then we can actually, again, start using civil society and academics to really shape what that global stock take says in the information input stage, which should start kind of, you know, in a year's time, basically. And then I think I'm very interested to see some of the UK's public finance priorities and private finance priorities. It's picked up on many of the issues that we've talked about today around access, around loss and damage finance. And I think we will see a lot more in light of the pandemic around new financial instruments, debt for climate swaps, debt restructuring, special drawing rights for climate. I think there will be a lot of talk of new financial instruments that I think will be very interesting to bring into the climate finance toolbox. And maybe kind of just more broadly, we really need to think about all finance flows. So we talk a lot about the green and the positive climate finance flows. And to quote Paul Bodnar again, it was him the first time I heard this, he said, you know, if you're on a diet, you don't just count how many salads you eat. We need to think about the other finance flows, and we need to invest as much attention in shifting away from the activities that are clearly Paris misaligned, or those that are just grey in general. The ones in the agriculture sector, for example, they're quite tricky to determine whether they're consistent or inconsistent based on the other kind of policies that are in place, like land tenure agreements. But we really need to focus attention, because climate finance, if you think about the climate funds, we're talking about less than 100 billion. If you talk about climate finance with the small c, small f, so, you know, including what the UK is spending in the UK, this is about 600 billion. But then when you start talking about, I mean, we mobilized 14.6 trillion for COVID around the world. And then that's just staggering amount more money than what we've been able to mobilize for climate finance. There's a lot more money out there, and we have to make sure that it's going in the right direction. And it's not going against our climate finance goals. So I'm very interested to hear a lot more being said about Article 21C of the Paris Agreement and how we get to making finance flows consistent with a pathway to low emission, climate resilient development. Thank you.
Thanks. So now we'll move on to questions from the audience. So if anyone has a question, they can put it in the chat, or you can raise your hand to indicate that you'd like to take the floor. Our first question is from Sakib Haq. Jacob asked, how can youth attract more climate finance? So any of our panelists or all can feel free to respond to this question.
The only thing I can answer to that is that we are working on that question as the Youngo working group, and we hope to be able to provide an answer soon. But yeah, so far it's a difficult question. So we need to explore. I think it's worth to explore also, and we intend to do that as a working group beyond mechanism and funding available beyond the UNFCCC, and also look at philanthropy, foundation, regional funds, bilateral funding. So that's quite a big landscape to explore. But yeah, I think this is an overarching project for us. So we'll keep you updated on this one.
I think that's a very good answer. I don't think I have a lot more to add on that. I mean, Agatha has talked about all the issues around scaling up and the issues of scale, and how much finance is needed. So I guess I can only think about kind of scaling, grouping up, grouping projects together, having a different framework for how that works. Also approaching philanthropy. I think that's a really good idea. And I think it kind of illustrates how, challenging it is for the climate finance architecture generally. So, it's, you guys keep an eye on the emerging debates as well, and some of the tools that will come out for improving access. But I sympathize that it's not easy.
Thanks. We have another question from Henry David Bayo. Henry asks, how effective is readiness finance?
I can start with that maybe. So just to be clear on what we mean by readiness finance. So there was, of course, a lot of issues around access to climate finance. And then, as I mentioned, there were a lot of efforts to try and improve access to climate finance. And the adaptation funds and the green climate funds in particular have specific readiness climate finance kind of funds or programs within. And the idea is to kind of build the capacities and institutions to program climate finance, as well as raise and access climate finance. So just looking at some figures, I think between the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, and the Adaptation Fund, they've collectively approved 286 million across 139 countries. And that's probably as of the end of 2020, beginning of 2021. And the Global Environment Fund also has elements of this, but they don't separate the figures. In terms of how effective it's been, I've never analyzed it myself, but what I understand from the literature is that a lot of the early finance was very much focused on access to multilateral climate change funds. And after a few reviews, we're shifting that towards accessing and programming climate finance more generally. And anecdotally, I've worked with a couple of countries that have received readiness funding from the Green Climate Funds. And what has been really interesting is that the finance sits with those departments, whether it's Department of Environment or Ministry of Finance. It's really nice for them to have the finance sitting in their coffers so that they can make the programming decisions and do the baseline studies, rather than having UNDP or other consultants come in and do those studies for them. So I think it's probably, how effective it's being is probably a little bit on an ad hoc basis, but I certainly see some signs of it changing and becoming more effective. Thank you.
Thanks. Agath, would you like to take the floor?
Yes, thank you. I have a question for Charlene regarding adaptation finance, because, well, I have the idea that adaptation is also more difficult to fund because you have less bankable projects, no? I mean, renewable energy, solar panel, well, these are projects that can be eventually bankable and provide financial returns, while restoring ecosystem or protecting mangrove that are adaptation projects with important environmental and social benefits, they are not necessarily bankable. So even though now we are able to more and more financially quantify these benefits, environmental or social benefits, it seems that we are not able to convert them in financial returns or benefits. And I just wanted to ask if you have any idea of financial instruments that can address this.
Thanks. Yeah. So it's absolutely harder to create bankable projects for adaptation. It doesn't mean it's impossible to do. I think for mitigation, what we have is a clearly quantified unit that can then be monetized, and then we can actually factor it into decision making a lot easier. And that is, a ton of emissions is a ton of emissions, based on the formula that we have, whether it's produced in South Africa, India, China, the UK, America, it's a ton of emissions. And we understand it to have a very similar impact. The problem with adaptation is that, we do not have the same kind of measure. Your vulnerability depends on your educational status, your social status, as well as the physical risk, the risk of a hurricane, for example. So it's very difficult to use kind of metrics that would apply across different countries. So, it costs a different amount. It's very difficult to articulate. It's very difficult to factor into decision making. In addition to which, a lot of adaptation is kind of a public good. So, tragedy of the commons, so on and so forth. But if you're trying to build up resilience, and you are a hotel, for example, maybe you would help build a seawall, but you would also produce public goods that others would benefit from. So, if you protect the beach or the mangroves, and other fishermen then have access to those waters, you're protecting them from hurricanes too. But it's very difficult for the hotel to then monetize those benefits that they've given to those fishermen. So it just becomes a lot more complicated to create that business case, because we know the economic case is strong. If you did a cost benefit analysis and you looked across the whole system, it's absolutely worthwhile to invest in adaptation. But for the individual business, it's very difficult. The shift and the change in the bottom line is harder to articulate and harder to build into investment planning. On top of what I've already said about, it being difficult to know what private actors are really doing, because they don't sit down and call it adaptation, they change their practices. So where do we go from here? What's been really interesting is the growth of the kind of the understanding of the materiality of climate risk. So instead of having the obligation to do it because of historical responsibility, private actors are saying, okay, we have physical climate risks. I understand that if I keep being hit by a hurricane, or a flood or so on and so forth, it's going to be very costly for me to get component parts for my business. My hotel is going to get damaged. The tourists can't come. People are understanding the physical risk to their businesses and their bottom lines. And there's also this issue of transitional risks. So, we value that coal power plant. However, if we all transition away from coal, that power plant isn't worth as much as the bank thought it was going to be worth. And so their asset isn't as valuable as they thought it was on the books. So we have these changes that are starting to change the perception of climate change and climate risks in the private sector. And I think combined with working with them to try and understand the economic case, to try and kind of make, resilience as an asset category, to try and build it into the cost of capital, for example, these are all shifts in the right direction. But in terms of, is there a particular financial instrument? It's very hard to say. I mean, we've already said that the role of public finance is there to kind of leverage and mobilize private investment. We can use that public investment to try and reduce the perceived and also the real risks of the private sector. So we can continue to kind of, support them through concessional loans, or help them with project structuring, or help them with developing project pipelines. I think it's kind of all of the above. We just have to move a lot faster, which is very difficult. And again, the problem of scaling up, the MDBs might want to fund a ginormous project, but adaptation is very local. The solution is very local for a particular point. And of course, we have a lot more around insurance these days, and whether insurance is a good financial instrument. The difficulty for insurance is really how do we fund it through international finance? Who pays the premium versus who pays the payout? Is it loss and damage? Is it adaptation? What if it becomes too risky? What if it's not even a functioning business model for the insurance company because the physical risks of climate change just become too high? So I think there are some good examples. I think the Craft Funds, the Lightsmith Group, there's some really good examples of very specific mechanisms where financial lending is being based on adaptation practices. So you have increased access to a loan, or you have a lower amount of collateral if you actually take resilience measures into account. And I think we need to learn from these smaller examples and then start scaling up these bigger products into commercial banks. Maybe your mortgage could be green, your green loans, so on and so forth. So again, I think it's this combination of the public-private finance and making sure we get into the more broader financial system. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Charlene. There's the next question from Keith. What are the take-home keywords for a glossary of climate finance? Anybody from the panelists who would like to answer the question?
I'm just trying to find the 2018 Standing Committee on Finance Biennial Assessment and Overview of Climate Finance Flows. It's an incredibly long title for the report. The Standing Committee on Finance is a body under the Conference of the Parties that has been mandated to support them in dealing with finance issues and advise on the financial mechanisms. And every 2 years, they produce a very good technical report. And I would say that I'm part of the technical team. And I'm pretty sure there must be a glossary in there. So I'm just looking for it now and I will put it in there. But in terms of the key things, I think we need to think about financial instruments. I think we need to think about access. I think we need to think about gender as well. We know that gender responsive finance, development finance is more effective. We need to understand how we do that with climate finance. Yeah, those are probably the main kind of topics to look out for.
Thank you very much, Charlene, for your answer, your intervention. Thank also to Agathe, Katie, Kervel, and Priti for the amazing session we had today. I think it has been very, very informative. So now we are at the end of the session. So I thank all the team for organizing this Step Up. So Adedeji, Dohir, Prakash, Manal, and all the team of the Youth Event Road to COP26, and of course the friends of the Finance Working Group, and of course Charlene Watson. So let's have the final remarks maybe from the moderator if they want to say some wrapping up final remarks. So the floor to Kervel and Priti to close with final remarks.
Nico, I'd just like to thank the panelists again and thank the audience for their attendance and engagement. And I would like to invite anyone who is interested in becoming involved in work in climate finance to join Youngo, become a member of the Finance and Market Working Group, pre-register for COI 16, which is currently open. There's also the option to host a local COI or a virtual COI, so you can engage with Youngo to learn more about how you can do that.
Thank you, Kervel. I don't know if Priti, do you want to add something?
Yeah. Thank you everyone for being a part of the session. I'm also really glad to be learning from the session because climate finance is itself a new topic for me. So it was quite an informative session and hope everybody had a good session as well. So thank you.
Okay, thanks. Let's close. And a final invitation to follow up the step ups. We're gonna keep update of the next. We are gonna do one by month till the COP26. So thank you very much again and have a nice day and see you soon. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, thanks.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.